You are listening to Season 6 of Future Ecologies.
Hey everyone, welcome back. No cold open this time, because on today's show, Sea Garden, we're diving right in to a story about food security, ecosystem restoration, and climate adaptation.
It's a story going back thousands of years into the past and, fingers crossed, thousands of years into the future. What does all that look like? Well,
you'll just have to wait and see.
Oh, now we'll get up to speed.
Broadcasting from the unceded, shared, and asserted territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. This is Future Ecologies, exploring the shape of our world through ecology, design, and sound.
Where are we? We're at the beach, and we're at one of the historic, what is now called a sea garden, previously known as the clam garden wall. And before it even had a name, I imagined that we would be at a grocery store. We were at my ancestors' grocery store, our dinner table. Squachel Hela, Quam Lashwith and a snake, just a Ethlison at Husainich Tungoch. Good day, everyone. My English name is Hannah, and my Chwilngosna is Chwam Leshawit, and I'm from here in the Husainich territory in Saanich. Helixin Quanas Ethla. I'm grateful to be here with you today.
I'm grateful to be here with you.
Thanks,
This place is so alive. It's hard
Isn't
to
it?
believe. Picture this. Low tide on a sunny day. A gently sloping beach, bright, not with sand, but with coarse bits of broken shell. All around you, buried clams are saying hello as they squirt jets of water into the air. The red rock crabs duck and dart all over the abundant green seaweed. And just there, behind you, on a boulder, a sea cucumber the size of a shoe, waiting patiently for the tide to return.
I feel extremely privileged. This is a work day. This is what I get to do for work. Come and check out the beach.
Including the most prominent feature of this beach, a rock wall stretching across the entire width of the low tide line.
All rocks have been placed there gently, specifically, and with a good heart in mind when it happened.
How long have those rocks been there?
Allegedly 3,500 years to 4,000. I don't know. I put some rocks on there about a year ago, so there's some new ones, some old ones. Oh, Carl's got a fork with it.
What are you doing right now, Carl?
Just digging to see what clams all come up with here. I think right here is mostly butters and stuff.
Hold on. Is that a barnacle?
That's an old barnacle, big one, eh?
That's a big one.
Yeah. My English name is Carl Olson. I'm from the Husainich community, Sartlip. I carry my grandfather's Indian name, it's Tsleil-Waututh. Go along the rock wall there and start digging, you'll see. The clams they're healthier, and that's what this wall provides too, a healthier environment. And you get much meatier clams. They're bigger, they're healthier.
Tell me what we're looking at.
What are we looking at? We're looking at rocks all piled up in wall form. And not only are there rocks in there are different species.
There is so much life in these places. They're alive.
I feel like I would be remiss in letting this day go by without having you, our resident marine ecologist, give me a lightning round of all the species you might find in a sea garden.
Oh boy, okay. Well, I mean, there's so many. And if you start getting into tube worms and shore crabs, I'm not going to be able to tell you what species they are. You'll see our superstars, the butter and little neck clams. Those tend to be the most targeted, harvestable native species. You'll see red rock crabs burrowing under the rocks, moving around under the green seaweed. Sea stars, sea cucumbers, limpets,
Whelks,
many different types of sea snails,
all sorts of barnacles, of course.
a lot of hermit crabs.
Sometimes little gunnels.
Urchins. Urchins is another one. We don't see a ton of them, but they do exist on the wall.
Lots of creatures, more than I've just mentioned.
Yeah, thinking about low tide, the water receding out, and you can see the top of the rock wall. That rock wall emerges, the waves coming offshore being broken by that rock wall, and you have a kind of a smooth, clear water inside the clam garden as the water's receding, and then the little clams start spurting out, shooting up little spurts of water up and down. And then as the water recedes and the rocks fully emerge, you can go down and crawl around the rocks and see red sea cucumber, red rock crab, chitons, large snails, and limpets.
And something that we don't see very often, but we know exists, that people actually sometimes create traps for, is giant Pacific octopus.
What else can be there? Chitons, mussels, yeah, the whole works. Feast.
Feast on the beach.
Feast on the beach, yeah.
You have this really complex ecosystem that emerges all within this rock wall system, and seaweeds and all these other traditional foods, and all of this three-dimensional structure, these rocks that are piled up with little hidey holes in them for other traditional foods to live in. And so it's this really unique system where, you know, as an intertidal ecologist, we'll go to soft sediment, sand, gravel, mud beaches, and look for clams and do our research there. Or we'll go to rocky intertidal, and that's where we study things like limpets and snails and things like that. But here you've got both of those things together.
So before I forget, could you introduce yourself?
Sure, yeah. I'm Erin Slade, and I'm a marine ecologist working with the Sea Garden Restoration Project at Parks Canada. I've been working on this project and with these wonderful communities and sea gardens for just over 4 years.
Hello, my name is Nicole Smith, and I am an archaeologist, fortunate to work along the coast for over 20 years.
OCM Nishaltasiam Sinisnat Marco Hatch. My name is Marco Hatch. I'm a member of the Samish Indian Nation and Associate Professor of Environmental Science at Western Washington University in Bellingham, Washington.
My name is Eric Kelch, born in Lekwungen Territory here on the West Coast, and work now for Parks Canada on the Sea Gardens project.
So, just to make sure we have it covered, what is a clam garden? How does it work?
Clam gardens are magical intertidal spaces where ancestors moved large rocks to the low tide line to flatten a beach, just like you could terrace a hill to grow more grapes, you can terrace a beach to grow more clams. And so these rocks at the low tide line, sediment then fills in between them. And so it takes a steep beach and it flattens it out. What that does is it increases the space in the what's called the Goldilocks zone. So butter clams and other clams live in a really narrow zone of the intertidal. If they live too high, they dry out and die. If they live too low, they get eaten by sea stars. So there's a really narrow window they like to live in. And these terraces are built in exactly that tidal level. You've got a rocky ecosystem that was built intentionally by people moving rocks, and then all that sediment that fills in that winds up being prime habitat and conditions for clams to grow. Through the Clam Garden Network, we've been able to measure and quantify things like 2 to 4 times the biomass of clams in a clam garden compared to a non-clam garden area, and growth rates about 50% or greater.
So sometimes they're actually built up in spaces that didn't previously have a sandy beach. And by creating a barrier between two rocky outcrops, you create the space for sand to start to fill in and creating basically a new beach where there didn't used to be. So they can be kind of on steep bouldering slopes. They can be between rocky outcrops on beaches that already exist, such as the one that we're at today on Russell Island, or something like the Fulford Harbor Sea Garden is a a big, long wall along a large, already kind of sandy gravel beach.
And then beyond the rocks, what are we seeing?
I see the bull kelp.
So this is a proper little kelp forest as well.
You bet.
Wow.
Clam gardens are only exposed a few days of the year at low tide. In the U.S., a lot of clam gardens will be expected to be around a negative 2-foot tide. In Canada, you're generally a meter or less.
One of the major challenges with, well, I don't know if it's necessarily a challenge, it's really just a nature of this type of work, and part of what makes it beautiful and special, but also limiting and fleeting, is that we can only really access these places for a few days every month in the summer, and then in the middle of the night when the tides are low enough in the winter.
With our most extreme tides during the winter and summer solstice. But those extreme tides in the winter happen at night. But yeah, being an intertidal ecologist, when you open your calendar for the year, you put in low tides, and then you plan everything around that. These areas can be extraordinarily vibrant, can have high densities of clams, and also defy what we think is possible. Having these clams at a higher tide line, if you could move the height of those clams up by 20 centimeters, now they're probably exposed more hours of the day and then more days a year, right? So if you're thinking about that as your grocery store, we've just opened it more days with longer hours, which is huge in the wintertime and other times when it might be marginal to go out and harvest.
Why did the name change from clam garden to sea garden?
Because there aren't just clams that live here.
One of the reasons that we call these spaces sea gardens is, at the guidance of the nations, these rock walls are multifaceted and multifunctional, and they don't just support clams, they support many other species.
Is there just one type of sea garden?
No, there are many, many different kinds of sea gardens, and there are around the world.
It's global, too. It's not just here on the West Coast, not just on Vancouver Island. It's everywhere.
There are going to be variations on the sea garden technologies that may target particular species or may be beneficial to many.
On the bays and fjords of Patagonia, corrales de pesca have been maintained by indigenous Chilean and mestizo people to harvest and store the abundance of the sea, including fish, eggs, shellfish, and seaweed.
Along the humid coastlines of the Taiwanese Penghu archipelago, monumental stone fish weirs, known as shihu, sprawl like enormous petrified jellyfish made of basalt, limestone, and coral.
For over 6,000 years, the Gunditjmara people have used volcanic stones to create pools and channels to capture kuyang, or short-finned eels, as they migrate to sea and back through the complex wetlands of southeastern Australia.
And here, up and down the west coast of North America, there are fish traps, octopus houses, and, of course, clam gardens. All around the Pacific Ocean, many forms of indigenous mariculture have been practiced since time immemorial.
I think fundamentally it's modifying a beach in a way that provides more food than would have been there on its own. So this idea that if you take an active part in restoring or tending a beach, then you could provide lots of food. Depending on culture, depending on what the beach offered you, what is naturally there, I think people were smart, and they really are emblematic of deep listening and deep paying attention and deep connection to a place. Dependent on what that site was what you would kind of modify it to be. And the different beaches are going to need different things.
It's so much more than just a collection of rocks that creates biomass or biodiversity. It's so much more than that. It's a revival of a portion of our language, a revival of the kinship ties between our nations, because long ago we were nomadic. We have all these overlapping shared spaces, and the Gulf Islands is definitely one of them. Aichquail na sia ya haitsap katana ta quail ainta alagamil tanisan at khalelt siam estimo ainta siam hitwa atat khalelt tamet My English name is Nicole Norris, and my traditional name is Alagamich. I am a very treasured member from the Halalt First Nation coming from the Halkominam homelands here on Vancouver Island. I'm a descendant of Stetson, and there's grand stories of Stetson being in these places. Stetson in our greater creation story is one of the first 4 that fell from the sky. It was him and his 3 brothers.
Long since Stetson fell from the sky, Nicole recalled the very first time that she visited a sea garden wall, walking under a moonlit low tide with her friend and colleague.
And we got to a certain part in the wall, and I pulled off my boots and my socks, and I began to nestle my feet into the sand, into the ground. And I turned and I looked at him. It was such a profound moment for myself. I turned and I looked at him and I said, I'm standing in Stetson's footprints. And I leaned over and I grabbed a rock off the wall and I put my hand on top of it. And I said, I'm holding a rock that Stetson held. I'm holding his hand.
Seeing these massive monumental rock features that ancestors had built and tended for thousands of years changed my view and understanding of intertidal ecology. When I was an undergrad, our fisheries professor would say that there's no way that Indigenous people in the Northwest impacted salmon populations. There wasn't enough people, and there's so many salmon, there's no way that people could have impacted that. And that was just what people accepted, 20 plus years ago. And then you start to learn about things like stonefish traps and fish weirs and the technology of existing to harvest every salmon that came up a stream. If you put a weir up, it's blocking the stream, and people are making the decision about which fish get to pass and which ones don't. Even in big rivers like the Columbia, all of those fish are going up to spawn in small tributaries, right? Like the technology existed to harvest every single fish that came up the river. That didn't happen, right? These environmental abundances that we're seeing didn't happen by accident. People had intention in their management. In the terrestrial realm, I think that's been accepted a bit earlier, particularly around burning, tending of camas meadows, Gary Oak. In the marine environment, it's been a bit harder, and one thing I think is really beautiful about revitalizing clam gardens and sea gardens is their very visual, tangible features. These are monumental rock features, sometimes a kilometer long, that people have built and maintained for thousands of years in a space that our ancestors have been removed from and our contributions have been ignored. It ties back into what is natural, how did these ecosystems get to where they are. Clam gardens give us that really visual, like hit you in the face. You can't deny that these thousands of pounds of rocks for a kilometer long stacked up were done by accident. Operating both in traditional knowledge or traditional ecological knowledge or Indigenous knowledge or whatever term you want to use for traditional knowledge systems and mainstream or Western science has historically had a lot of tension and difficulties. There's a few models that we practice that can help provide ways forward. And one metaphor that's often used is the idea of braiding, so braiding traditional ecological knowledge and mainstream science together. And in the braiding metaphor, each strand maintains its identity and isn't compromised or compared or held above or below the other strand. But by combining those knowledge systems, we can create something stronger than the sum of its parts.
Traditional science and Western science is the same. It's just different language that translates it. Indigenous knowledge is based on generational observation. All of those teachings come from observing the water, observing the wind, how it interacts with the land, the water, the trees, but also observing our relatives of the ocean, our relatives of the woods, and our relatives of the sky. They provide us with teachings of ways of being. And so the clam doesn't feed just us. It feeds aquatic loved ones. It feeds the woodland animals that come onto the beach and harvest. It also feeds certain birds, our relatives of the sky. And so that clam feeds the fish, it feeds the crabs, it feeds the octopus, it feeds the eagles, the seagulls, the oyster pickers. What we recognize is that it's all interconnected and how valuable that one single clam is.
So a big question is, how old is this technology of sea gardening? And how do we know?
Well, from the archaeological work that we've been doing on the coast, it would seem that these sea gardens or clam gardens are at least 4,000 years or so. Now, of course, in archaeological terms, dates are always a little bit fuzzy. It's tricky because these rock walls, they're made of rock, it's inorganic, and radiocarbon dating needs organic carbon to establish a date. If you can imagine that these walls, sometimes they build up over time, sometimes the foundation of them are built in a moment. People will get the rock from different places. Sometimes they'll get it from land and they'll bring it to the beach. Other times they'll get the rock from the beach themselves. And when they get it from the beach, the rocks can be covered with barnacles. Now, the barnacles tend to like to live on the top, but if you can imagine, sometimes those first rocks will go into the wall, and if they get turned upside down and those barnacles then go onto the underside of the rock, they can get trapped in the muck or the mud and, in the right conditions, preserve. So what we found is that we could look for those barnacle scars on the bottom of the rock.
And so they can date those scars.
In a regular beach setting, they will only last on the surface of a rock for 1 to 2 years, we learned from the barnacle biologists, because beaches are actually really clean places. And when a barnacle dies, there's all sorts of organisms that are going to come to scrape that basal plate off. Things like bulldozing limpets, will come along and clean the surface of the rock so that then it's available for new barnacle larvae to settle. So when we find a preserved barnacle scar, that's exciting, and we know that we have a very tight time range.
And besides preserved barnacle scars, archaeologists have other evidence that these clam gardens go back for millennia.
They've noticed that the rock walls change where their location was based on tidal height. Where the rocks were placed were at a different place on the beach depending on where the ocean was.
So there's two competing factors. There's isostatic rebound and sea level rise.
Parts of the coast where the glaciers were really thick and really heavy, really depressed the land down. Some of us might remember waterbeds. If you sit in the middle of a waterbed, you go down in the middle and the sides go up. Well, that was similar here on the coast, like around Kitimat and extending down. But then other parts of the coast, like Haida Gwaii, didn't have as much and they were on those edges, so they popped up.
Isostatic rebound was explained to me by my marine geology professor as every Thanksgiving, his Uncle Eli would come over, who was a rather massive fellow, and would sit and watch football on the couch. And then when he got up, the couch would slowly come back to level. Isostatic rebound is effectively that. For when we had a mile of ice over this area, that ice is melted and the land is slowly coming back up.
And so where it was weighted down starts to come up, where it was up starts to go down.
Compared with sea level rise, which is the whole bathtub is getting higher.
What effectively happens is you have these changes in sea level positions, but it's really different depending on where you are on the coast. Some places it's falling and other places it's rising.
And so we see more ancient clam gardens that are now well above the clam zone, and newer ones are built at the current tide height. In other communities, we see walls that are meters below sea level today. And so these technologies have been used for thousands and thousands of years to adapt to local sea level change.
In the Southern Gulf Islands, sea levels have been rising for over 11,000 years. When we talk about the relevance of this type of work moving forward, these are spaces that have been adapting to sea level rise for thousands of years.
So I think that's important for everyone to know, and archaeologists to know, that depending on where you are, they might be really subtle. And we don't want to say that, there are none in this area. They just might not be in view. I mean, there are past shorelines that are now way underwater, and there are past shorelines that are way high inland and now covered in forest canopy. So far, our survey's really been limited to the present intertidal zone. So it's possible there are older features that we haven't seen because we haven't been looking in the right places.
There may be hidden gardens, below the waves or behind the trees. And so we can't say for sure how old this technology really is.
No amount of archaeology and carbon dating is going to be able to prove it. Unfortunately, they can say that, yeah, we've been here for a really long time, and they can investigate some of the shells and the spaces and theorize how we used to cook.
Because these rocks have probably been in the wall longer than just their latest millennia-old barnacle scars.
Oh, totally. That's definitely true. And that's one thing that we think that they're dismantling and rebuilding as sea level is rising.
We're the saltwater people. We travel by canoe, and we camped here. We had a food base when we're heading down to visit our relatives in Lummi, and we'd camp in the San Juan Islands, do the same thing. We never really had to carry food with us because the food base was feeding us on our way. That's the way it should be. You know, when you have like 4 million people in Canada that are food insecure, and we have beaches that we could maintain and keep healthy, you know, having this is food security, and we got to bring it back.
Yes, we live on an island. There's beach everywhere. Unfortunately, there aren't clam gardens everywhere the way that there used to be, but there is beach everywhere. We live on Vancouver Island, and with that, I find it easier to explain to community what's outside of our back door and what would be there without colonization.
It's constantly shocking to me that we have this intertidal resource that's so bountiful, that's so healthy for us, that's so free in a way with rising food prices, and we don't take care of it. We don't take care of it properly. There's closure maps everywhere and you can't harvest. And why aren't we treating this like a resource that we could all benefit from? To have like a food that can be processed, that can be dried, that can be traded, that is always going to be productive if you take care of it. The teaching that if you take care of these places, they will take care of you, I think speaks volumes.
We've seen some communities reactivate clam gardening after experiencing food scarcity and shortages through COVID-19. And so for a lot of remote communities, external food is barged in. And if that barge doesn't show up, that's a real concern. And those communities have taken a conscious effort to revitalize traditional food systems, and clam gardens being a part of that, of ensuring that there's that resilience within the community in case external food doesn't show up, that they have the knowledge, the technologies, the gatherers, the processors within their community that they know where to go and how to get to work.
Unfortunately, the question of where to go is sometimes complicated by a second question.
Are the clams even safe to eat?
I think it's important when you're managing closures for seafood safety or human health concerns to think about how are people actually consuming those. Knowing how things are prepared, what parts are discarded, changes an individual's exposure level. So butter clams is a large clam that in this area people dried and traded. And depending on the community, there are different ways of processing the clam. A lot of communities will take the black tip off the siphon. So the siphon is where the clam brings water in and ejects water. Butter clams have a black tip of that siphon. A lot of communities cut that off and discard it, citing that that's where the toxins are stored.
So-called red tide is caused by population booms of a naturally occurring microorganism, a dinoflagellate called Alexandrium,
which produces saxitoxin, a potentially lethal neurotoxin.
And it's existed forever, but in recent years, both the frequency, how often we get these red tide blooms, and the duration and the window of opportunity have all increased. And so it's happening more often and with stronger red tides now compared to 500 years ago. But we were curious, looking at a butter clam, can we measure the amount of toxin in each body part? And we found that both the siphon tip and the siphon disproportionately held more saxitoxin. Now, this isn't to say, if there's a red tide closure, go out there and chop the neck off a clam, siphon off a clam, and you're safe. But it does show that those parts of the body have a higher concentration of saxitoxin compared to other areas. And so that's where we're trying to operate, of not testing traditional ecological knowledge, but trying to see, is there ways we can quantify it as it relates to how we open and close clams. And certain communities have actually been able to do that, where working with government agencies, when they go in to test butter clams, they'll test the whole clam and they'll test the clam without the siphon. And so there'll be certain times of the year where clams are deemed safe to eat if you discard the siphon. And that's an example of incorporating that traditional ecological knowledge into the way that we measure and manage traditional food as it relates to seafood safety.
So you might be wondering, when the clams aren't safe to eat, is it still worthwhile to work in the garden?
Even though we're not digging clams and having a clam bake on the beach, there's so much more that comes from it.
These are places that need to be cared for on an ongoing basis. You need to tend the beaches. You need to care for the rock wall. And as shared, these are places that you care for like you might a family member.
It's not rocket science. This is simply how it's done to really humanize our aquatic loved ones. When I talk about that point of view from a clam, or I talk about noise pollution, I talk about our loved ones in the woods and the sky, right?
And so it's this wonderful way of seeing people in relationship with the environment around them as equals, as opposed to being separate from.
So you mentioned the nuancing of clam gardens to sea gardens to open up this more general space for different creatures. I'm curious about the garden part of the name.
I think the really important part of garden is that it's really speaking to tending and caring for places. One of the dominant narratives was that First Nations communities up and down this coast are hunter-gatherer populations. And in the textbooks, you would see how they would be described as living in very bountiful environments where the resources essentially swim to them, instead of understanding the agency and the care and the engineering that has gone into shaping these landscapes.
We used to think people mean they're degrading the environment, and so we need to take people out of the environment to protect it. That's what the Western kind of world used to think about conservation. And now we're learning, hopefully we're learning, at least I'm learning, that places need people, and these ecosystems weren't created by accident, and people were involved in making them bountiful. And so by people being here and tending a sea garden in all sorts of ways, it actually increases the biodiversity of a place. Like, what a concept. And so people being here is what they need to thrive. And we see places where it's not thriving. It's kind of dead. There's a lot of empty shells. There's not many clams because it hasn't been dug up.
When we come back, a lesson in gardening after the break.
Hi, you haven't heard from me before, but I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Eden, and I joined the team at Future Ecologies earlier this year. I've been working behind the scenes, but I'm here to remind you that this podcast is supported by you, our listeners. We are ad-free, independent, and crowd-funded. There are so many reasons you might want to support this podcast. Maybe you believe in the power of independent media, answerable only to you, our audience. Maybe you care deeply about the kind of stories that we're telling, and you recognize that it takes a lot of time and effort to tell them. Or maybe you just want access to new episodes before anyone else, exclusive bonus content, and our community Discord server, plus stickers, embroidered patches, or a cozy hat. No matter the reason, we rely on your support. So, if you feel fed by what you've been hearing, you can return the favor and keep us going and growing. Help us produce the show for as little as $1 each month or at any amount that you choose. at futureecologies.net/join. That's futureecologies.net/join. Okay, back to the show.
Where we left off, Eric was reminding us that these spaces need to be nurtured for their own sake, and so that they can nurture us in return.
What happens when a clam garden bed is not really maintained, and it hasn't been for years and years? The buildup of the amount of clams in this bed gets so great that they just start dying off, and that's what you're seeing.
Traditional teachings around, if you don't tend the beach, it dies. If you don't dig a certain way and you don't put your sediment down a certain way, you don't harvest a certain way, it'll harm the beach.
If you're hand tilling the beach, you want to turn over the substrate so that it aerates, so that water can filter through and all of the years of silt can wash away.
And in anoxic or hypoxic, no to low oxygen areas of the sediment, aerobic respiration doesn't happen, respiration using oxygen like we do. So you have anaerobic respiration, which is typically done by sulfate-reducing bacteria, which produce hydrogen sulfide as a byproduct, which is both toxic to juvenile clams and gives that rotten egg smell. And so if you don't tend the beach, you get a lot of fine-grained sediment, which tends to be organic, which tends to reduce oxygen, which sets up those conditions for hydrogen sulfide. So by tilling it, we're physically like turning the sediment over, or the way that we dig clams and leave the sediment out gives that opportunity for the fine-grained sediments to wash away.
It's like cultivating a garden. You cultivate it here too. You turn it over so it keeps the ground loose, and at low tide the air gets into it. And these rock walls kind of break down just because of the waves from the boat or the movement of the tide. You got to keep maintaining them. We clean off the seaweed here. One of the elders explained that some of the seaweed, best to get it taken off because it's like having a piece of plastic over.
When we're doing restoration work, that seaweed gets scraped off and brought up to the bushes back here for a little bit of fertilization, as well as to help keep the clams breathing. They, like us, need oxygen to breathe.
We use potato rakes to hand till the substrate. That process needs to be so mindful because that's somebody's home. My Uncle George Harris always talks about getting your mind right. So when you're there for a helpful purpose, your intention is to help. We're helping the ancestors finish their work because they're not here to do it anymore. And so you got to be careful. Lautlamafut is what they call that. Be really careful.
There are some people I've come down seeing walking along the wall where you just don't know. You don't know what you don't know. So sharing we stay off the wall, we treat it with respect, we treat the beach how we would want to be treated.
Culturally, there are certain times in the year that we're not supposed to walk on the beach, and maybe to share that information so that people are more mindful when they go into these places. At the time when the herring spawn, when the waters are just a little bit warmer, when the clams spawn, or the sea urchin and the oysters when they're doing their thing, that's the time when you stay off the beach.
My grandparents always used to say, watch the birds when you go down, like seagulls or crows. Will bring the clam up and drop it on the rocks to break it open and eat it. If they're doing that, they said, the clams are good to eat. And they say, watch the birds. If they stop eating the clams, then you stop eating the clams. They'll tell you, everything is connected. There's a connection to everything. Because everything has a life. And when you use it to feed yourself, you give thanks for it to the Creator. If you take care of everything, it's going to take care of you.
If you're looking for a mnemonic, just remember, watch.
That we all take care of the harvest. Yes, I love that acronym as well. How are we being there and taking care of it? And that's That's what these places need. They need people. Makes them happy.
Could you tell me a little bit about the balance between tending and harvesting and the sort of the practice of gardening in these spaces? What does that look like for communities through time?
It's not like you build a wall and leave it. That might be what some of us do in our yards or in our cities or towns. These are places that need to be cared for on an ongoing basis.
And what I really appreciate about it is it's not looking for a short-term solution, meaning we went out and restored a beach, and next year we expect 10 times more clams. It's a long-term investment. People are doing it not because they might see direct benefit, but that their children and grandchildren will be re-engaged out there, will be part of the ecosystem, will be on the beach harvesting healthy, abundant clams. If we think about clam gardens that we've dated that are 3,000+ years old, that's 3,000 years of continuous tending with a small pause recently. That's a big commitment. That's a different commitment than I'm going to go out and remove invasive plants for a couple weekends a year, or I'm going to go out and plant some native trees. That is a long-term, multi-generational commitment that has to be weighed and taken seriously. Start with one, invest our time, build those relationships, improve that beach, and see what comes.
This work takes a lot of hands and a lot of hours, and so we have a pretty enormous volunteer list at this point, so we have lots of extra hands, but this is work that's led by the nations, and it's important that people from community are here leading that work. And so it's just a matter of getting enough people, being organized enough in advance, and people having enough space and time spread across the few days that we have to actually do the work, because these low tides are fleeting.
The work that Erin is referring to are beach days, but not the kind that you or I might have grown up with. These beach days are all ages community gardening and teaching events, organized under the auspices of the Sea Gardens Project.
What is the Sea Gardens Project?
The Sea Gardens Project is a collaborative effort between Parks Canada and guided by Saanich and Cowichan Nations to restore the beaches, of which we're standing at one right now, to provide food for Indigenous peoples into the future forever, to restore the sea gardens, provide food, and then to make sure that they're tended as they once were for millennia into the future by First Nations.
We're between Sydney and Salt Spring Island on a little island called Russell Island.
These gardens that we're looking at here haven't been tended for maybe 100 years or so. They were not tended until this project kind of restarted about 8 years ago. And so what we don't really know is what is the effort required to restore a sea garden that hasn't been tended. That's kind of a new question, I guess. And so by having two sides of the beach, we have a side here that we actively manage and actively tend and restore. And then we have a side here to our right that we don't do anything with. And so we're curious, what is the difference? And it's tricky because we never want to be in a place where we're having to prove Indigenous science. Indigenous science is knowledge on its own, and we don't want to be testing that or trying to prove that.
It's just something that we know, but we have to prove it all the time.
There's maybe another way to speak to a different kind of language, I guess. We can use other methods to share that story also.
The pathway that has been created between the Hulkaminam and the Sinchothan and Parks Canada has really become a worldwide demonstration of a better way of being together, about marrying Indigenous knowledge with Western science.
My title is a restoration officer. I lead a lot of the ecological monitoring that we do. And so as we conduct this restoration work that's guided by community, we're also monitoring how that work is impacting the ecosystems, and particularly the bivalve, the clam species. The clam communities and all of the seaweeds and invertebrates along the walls, we monitor how those are changing over time. We've also, over the years, been trying to monitor how the geomorphology, how the topography of the beach is changing over time, because we do expect to see that the beach will slowly shift in slope over time.
From this rock this way, I believe it's what's being restored with parks. And from down that way, down that side of the beach, is not being restored.
So this is the dividing line between the restoration project and the control?
Yeah.
The design of the project was put together with community members. And people were okay with starting things off as an experiment. And part of that is because, we do currently still live in a society where a lot of the most respected knowledge that is used by government to guide decision-making comes from the scientific community. And so in order to speak that language, doing an experiment supports us being able to kind of provide that type of knowledge to provide evidence towards this work being important and impactful and effective.
We have to be able to prove to Western science that our methods also work. We know that they work because that clam garden is 4,000 years old, and that is the way it's always been done. Without scientific research and the data and the hypothesis behind it, the language that translates that, how are we to get somebody who isn't so culturally, emotionally, and generationally tied to that space, how are we to get them to see it as important or to see the reasons why we need to do certain things, like have more restoration days or put more money into the program so that we can even get there? That data is going to support the underlying reasons as to why we want to do that, which is it's a food source. We need to cultivate it and we need to nourish it. And here's the reasons why.
But it's challenging because, people come here and spend a lot of time observing and working in these spaces and care a lot about them, and having to only work on one half of the beach, only tend one half of the beach. That doesn't sit well with people.
It's like having a hamper full of dirty laundry and you only wash half of it. We have a cultural obligation to take care of these spaces because it's what takes care of us. That's really what it comes down to.
The timelines for seeing the impacts ecologically are not short, and they're also not entirely clear. But we know, like the life cycle of clams, it takes a while to start seeing the response in the clams and then to start seeing that in the juvenile population.
I didn't know this until just this past year, but clams have these kind of, what are they called, like sporadic seeding events where they seed in large numbers, and those happen every 3 or 5 or 7 year marks.
And what we expect to see is kind of with the settlement of juveniles coming from a stronger adult population, we start to see a new crop of adults, and that can take many years.
We are seeing a comeback of some of the biomass, which is fantastic. We're seeing other aquatic plants starting to grow, vegetation starting to grow there, which is fantastic. But I said to them just last summer, I'm done with this test. Okay, I want the whole beach. And I was getting pretty forthright. They were like, oh, well, the test, this, that. And I pushed back and I said, listen, I want the whole beach. I want to turn over the whole beach. I want to measure it. I want to section it off. I want to start seeding. We only have this many years left. And I said, stop pussyfooting around. We need to get this work done. And I said to my colleagues at Parks Canada, I feel like I'm wasting my time. This is lip service. Either we're going to do it or we're not. Some of these spaces we've been working at for a decade. We've been turning them over for a decade. So the site beside us, that's the controlled site, is going to take the same amount of effort when we should have been doing the whole thing all along.
Well, I think that's, it's one of the challenges in working in ecology is, having the humility to recognize that you can't, these systems are not entirely unknowable, but they are not entirely knowable. This isn't like a lab experiment. When you work with ecology, you're working with complex ecosystems that interact with each other. And you can never have, well, not never, but in most circumstances, you're not going to be able to control all of the factors in order to be able to sort of distill things down into one particular mechanism or function or species. It bleeds into the Indigenous way of knowing that we respect that these spaces cannot be entirely known, but what we can do is spend time in them and build relationships with them and find ways to care for them that follow what we do know. And in doing so, having less rigidity and more adaptability is just generally the way things are done.
The other thing that this has demonstrated is this is an act of reconciliation on behalf of a federal agency, Parks Canada, and their humble friendship making with the Hulkaminam and the Sanchothan is really an act of reconciliation. Our original relationship was with the land, it wasn't with government. And they have provided us an opportunity to regain access. And even though some of these places are more than likely deemed as a heritage site, they've allowed us to operate them as active management sites, recognizing that this is going to revive a food source and create food security and food sovereignty for nations along the coast. And this really falls in line with the right to self-determination.
And beyond the interface between the Hulkaminam, the Sanchothan, and Parks Canada, Sea Gardens are now truly a place of international relations.
One of the greater things about some of this work is we've gone through a process with our sister nations about knowledge repatriation.
The Pacific Sea Garden Collective is this really amazing network of Indigenous people and allies that work closely with them from all around the Pacific, from Washington State, coastal BC, Southeast Alaska, Hawaii, Guam, and Palau, that get together every year or two and share our ancestral technologies and restoration work that we're doing. And through this network, we're learning from each other, but also understanding that we're experiencing a lot of the same struggles and issues. As a clam gardener going to Hawaii in 2020 and seeing the fish pond restoration, it really opened our eyes to what could be possible.
More recently, lots of nations have started their own initiatives to restore and rebuild or build new clam gardens or sea gardens up and down the coast.
Many of us share this hope and goal that there will be communities who are digging in their clamming beaches and restoring their clam garden walls or building new clam garden walls. I mean, we're seeing that already. And it really is connecting people with tradition. It is addressing issues of food security, issues of climate change. You know, I feel really hopeful for what Sea Gardens can offer and help us with as we go forward.
Swinomish came to spend a lot of time with us, and they've built the first modern day sea garden. The Swinomish are my immediate relatives, and I'm so exceptionally proud of them. What really opened my eyes was the amount of permits that they needed, the amount of other entities that needed to say yes.
They built their own wall about a year ago and had to jump through many, many hoops due to the government and whatever else they had to go through to put rocks on their own land. And it was a week of being Indigenous together. Not just Coast Salish people, they're all Indigenous people. Just by being together in an Indigenous collaborative with no, I don't know, would you say maybe hidden agenda that the federal government had when they came to Indigenous lands, sparked enough inspiration and drive for everyone to get back onto their own lands, to take care of it in the way that they know how, whatever that looks like. Whether that be lunch on the beach and just spending time, or getting your hands dirty in the water, moving rock. I really, really try my best anytime I come out here, not only to just bring myself, but to bring someone from my community in a younger generation to show them that it's okay and it's probably the right thing to do to reconcile and work together with Parks Canada and the federal government in order to restore our practices and work together as one to take care of the land that we're all here on now. Whether we like it or not, this is our reality, and it's a good one. It could be a good one if we make it.
Marco shared a story from a time he was visiting Bella Bella, Hiltsuk territory, where there are clam gardens that have been continuously tended until much more recently than the site at Russell Island. He and his local guides were traveling by boat.
And it was getting later in the day, and the tide was up pretty high, and off to our right, I saw a small little rock wall on this bedrock feature, so just hard bedrock, and a little rock wall, and then white broken shell hash behind it. So I was like, hey, just drop me off here. I grabbed all my survey equipment, and it's not high tide, but it's above low tide, so clam gardens are well underwater, and the butter clam zone, now the tide's above the butter clam zone, so I wouldn't expect to see butter clams there. And I was looking around, it's just broken dead shells everywhere, butter clams and some horse clams and all these different species. I was like, wow, this is really amazing. And I reached down and just both my hands scoop up a big chunk of the sediment, which is all just white, chalky, broken shell. And it was full of butter clams. I've never seen that many butter clams. Normally a butter clam is lower on the beach, but also lower in the sediment, where you'd have to dig down a good 6 centimeters or 10 centimeters before you get to the butter clams. Here it was a layer of clams, and below that layer was another layer of clams, and below that layer was another layer of clams. And it was just chock-a-block full of clams. And so here are this highest density to this day of clams I've ever seen in this little feature that's too high based on the textbooks for clams to live in. Now they're not just living there, but they're thriving in this immense density. And so I was just blown away. I was doing all the measurements just with my head like literally in the sand, like freaking out about all these clams. And I start to think, oh man, I wonder if they're going to come back and get me. They were out of sight around the corner. I couldn't hear the boat or anything. And so I'm looking around the corner, and I see off in the distance, I'm like, well, there's a stone fish trap over there. And I'm stuck on this bedrock outcropping, and I walk to the other side, and I see an abalone shell. And you can look down in the water, and there's this steep cliff of bedrock in crystal clear water with fish and kelp and abalone habitat all around in the same area as well. And you can look up and see the fruits and berries that the upland's been managed as well. And it was that point that kind of hit me that I've spent a lot of my time with a head in the sand just looking at clams within clam gardens. But if you move your head up and look around, you start to see that this is one very important piece, but one piece of the puzzle, one piece of the traditional food system of mountaintop to seafloor bottom.
Our ancestors had this figured out, and I'm thankful for my ancestors. And that's why I got to be passing it on to my grandkids and to my kids, so that they know the history of this place. They know the stories of this place. They know why we maintain these clam garden beds and why these rock walls were built and were known as clam gardens. The more that you talk about it with anyone, the more people will understand First Nations and how they survived. And I think it's really important.
And really what it is it's about trying to prepare a table for our great-greats that are yet to come.
I have a little great-great-grandniece that's been out here already, learning about what's in the water there. And it sticks with them, even at that age. They'll learn more as they grow older, but they need to be here.
One of the things that I say when we have new visitors is, if you listen carefully on those paths, you can still hear the songs of the people that were there before us. That Stetson's words still vibrate among those leaves. And eventually my words will vibrate there for my descendants.
As sea levels rise, our window to rediscover many long since tended gardens is closing. So at low tide, keep your eyes peeled.
And if you spot one, or if your community would like some guidance on how to revive or build a new one, get in touch with the Clam Garden Network at clamgarden.com.
To learn more about the many other types of sea gardens in the Pacific Sea Garden Collective, visit seagardens.net. Future Ecologies is an independent production.
You can find us and all of our episodes at futureecologies.net.
Or wherever you get your podcasts. If you like what we do, you can help us to do it by supporting the show with any amount at futureecologies.net/join.
And if money is tight, you can still do us a big favor by rating the show and leaving a comment wherever you're listening.
And of course, share it with everyone you know.
Goes without saying.
This episode was produced by me, Mendel Skolsky, with help from Adam Huggins and Eden Zinchik.
Featuring the voices of Hannah Morris, Carl Olson, Aaron Slade, Nicole Smith, Marco Hatch, Eric Kelch, and Nicole Norris.
With music by Jonathan Kachuk, Daniel Sapp, Thumbug, Adi Gortler, Gamelon Bike, and Sunfish Moon Light.
And of course, cover art by Ale Silva.
Special thanks to Sky Augustine, Eric Kelch, Courtney Grainer, Miranda Post, Jennifer Iredale, and to everyone out there bringing sea gardens to life. Okay, that's it for this one. See you at the beach.